Hello, everyone. Welcome to Recommentary podcast. Today we have with us Subhashish Bhadra, who's part of the leadership team of Club, and who's an author, who's a columnist, who has written extensively about data privacy, and currently he's working in one of the leading fintech startups in a leadership position. So, thank you so much, Subhashish, for joining, and welcome.
Thank you so much for inviting me, Gautam. Pleasure to be here.
Yeah. So I want to start off with the first thing that has caught my attention, and you had sent me the message when it got released as well. Your book, Cage Tiger. I was able to find some time to read some of the chapters, some of the introductory chapters, and it is totally in line with my vision of how a government should be running, how a country should be running, focusing on important aspects of institutions. So I want to start off with that. How did the idea come about, and what is the feeling of what is the feeling of having released a book of that stature and that scale?
Thank you for your question, Gautam. The the reflections I've had over the past several years and perhaps stretching back to a decade is that while Gen Z and millennials, which both of us belong to, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners are belong to as well, is perceived to be politically aloof or indifferent or casual about politics, that's actually not true. I think with a lot of the basic necessities of life having been sorted out for many large parts of India's population, as India has now transitioned to an economy where the per capita income is greater than $2,000, there is greater awareness of the higher order requirements of citizens to live a very fulfilled life. And I think, therefore, Indian citizens and Indian youth in particular are more politically conscious, are more politically aware than ever before. At the same time, the in parallel, our politics has perhaps become more fragmented, more name calling, more politicized, so as to say, more polarized, and that's across the globe, not just in India. The purpose of writing this book is to say that no matter what our political affiliations are, no matter what our affiliations on economic issues are, there are some things that we can align on, which is how do we get to decisions? How should institutions be set up? So it might be true that maybe I believe in capitalism and you believe in socialism, but there has to be some common ground we can find about the rules of the game. And that common ground doesn't exist in India as effectively. That, I think, is a story that people need to realize, that regular people need to talk about. That we assume, for example, that yes, a certain decision gets made by government in a particular way and that is how it is meant to be. In this book, I try to talk about the fact that the way institutions are set up actually directly affects how decisions get made. So if you think about demonetization, there's a very strong causal link between demonetization and the structure of the RBI. And that's the background that I want to bring out to people. A lot of this conversation currently happens in think tanks and academia, and I want to bring that out and have young people, have Gen Z and millennials talk about it. So that's the purpose behind this book.
Absolutely, and that's what I felt while reading it as well. In many ways, you are bringing down the idea of the concepts that generally the public policy practitioners try to converse amongst themselves. You have brought it, you have democratized it in many ways. You have brought all those concepts into a structure, into a format in which a layman can understand. I think that's the biggest takeaway for me. And I really liked, and I was when I was going through the text, I really liked the idea, the introductory passage in which it was written why Indians trust government a lot. And I think it was a very very good sociological analysis, especially the part where you connected the trust that coming from our trust that with the trust that we give to our families and the patriarchs and the matriarchs of families. That was a fascinating point, fascinating insight into how Indian psyche works. Is that something of a personal reflection? I mean, how did that come about? I'm very curious.
I think that is definitely true, especially when you contextualize against what happens in the US, right? And the American culture has historically been driven by a very individualistic culture, right? To the extent that John F. Kennedy had to step in and say, don't ask what the country can do, but what you can do for the country. But because there is that individualistic streak, and therefore, they are far more accustomed to being dissatisfied with their politics. Whereas we come from a culture where we come from scarcity, we kind of appreciate things, we have this sense of belonging to a community that could be our region, our state, our district, city, country, whatever else. Right? It's a far more civilizational country than for example, the US. And I think that brings forth this level of attachment that no matter what it is still something that belongs to me, that's part of my community, right? I might disagree with a chief minister or a prime minister, but most Indians will probably be fairly offended or would not like appreciate someone else criticizing it, right? It's more like it's within the family and I'm going to talk this out here. So I think there are deep sociological roots to this. I am not a sociologist, so therefore this is a section of a chapter rather than a book itself. But I think there's a lot more to be said about how the sociology and the culture of a civilization affects the way the governments are set up.
Right. And the other aspect I really liked about the part in which you highlight the incentives and how incentives are important for anything to work. I mean, be it business, be it government, be it any institution. What is something that leads to somebody doing something for someone, right? I think that the incentive structure in business, now that you're in a business position, I'm sure you understand in a different context in terms of business. But even for public institutions, accountability, incentives are all important. I think that is my other takeaway from the book, it being very important. So I just want to connect that. Yeah, please go on. Please go on. Sorry, you have something
No,
to say.
absolutely. And I think incentives is a big part of it. And this is a point that Amit Verma keeps making that
Yeah,
while all of us talk about our immediate post independence political leaders being of higher moral character, while that might be true, but there's also a self selection that possibly happened in British time. In British time, if you had to enter politics, you knew that there was possibly not too much power at play, there was not too much financial gain at play, and therefore the people who entered politics in the last few decades of British rule were probably those who were genuinely driven by the fact of social service, of independence, of doing better for the country. As we got independent and as political masters started having access to resources through corruption or other means, then the kind of people who started entering politics became those who actually pursued that power. And this specifically in the 1970s, with the disintegration of the Congress's power, we saw a lot of criminals enter politics at that time because they realized, hey, look, we don't even need to be dependent on politicians to access that power. We can directly get into this. And there's you see a steep increase in the criminalization of politics in the 70s onwards. And that is something that continues till date. And today we've reached that stage where not only are there's incentive for people who are lured by power and money to enter politics, but those who don't aren't lured by the barriers for them to enter because politics has now become so expensive to fight. So I think this whole point of incentives and the financials behind politics is also something not enough people speak about. Milan Vaishnav has written extensively about it, and I think the youth of the country do need to discuss this in more detail.
right, right, totally. And now I want to understand what has been your the. I mean, many people of that we know want to be a published author, and most of them where they struggle is how to go about publishing a book, even how to come about an idea, how to research about chapters, how to create, how to craft your your draft. Would you have any like a framework in mind where you have approached this book, how to go about writing this book? It would be interesting for viewers to know.
The thing many people don't realize or appreciate enough is that book publishing is also business. And in fact, I come from the venture capital space. It's actually very, very similar to venture capital. If you look at all books that are published by any publishing house, there's probably the top 10 to 20%, or maybe even lesser, right? Probably maybe the top 5% that really make the bulk of the money. These are books that are selling hundreds and thousands of copies. Then there's a mid tier of perhaps 20 to 30%, or maybe 50% of the books where you kind of break even and you maybe make a little bit of money, and then there are all these write offs where you make losses as a publisher. So, what you have to convince the publisher if you want to get published through one of these publishing houses is that you can deliver commercially. So yes, your book is important and it's one of the factors that leads to whether your book is going to be commercial success or not. But what's more important than the manuscript itself is the marketing plan you have. If I write a terrible book, but I can still convince my publisher that this is going to sell 20,000, 30,000 copies, that'll probably get published. So therefore, in terms of the process, the most important thing is to really think about who's going to buy this, why are they going to buy this, how many people are going to buy this. So that's like, you can play around with a whole bunch of ideas, but then you have to distill it down to just these cold numbers in the business of book writing. Um, Typically, when you reach out to a non-fiction publisher, they're going to ask you for your proposal and they're going to ask you for two or three sample chapters. What a lot of people don't also realize in book publishing is that typically publishers will only publish book that come to them through agents. So before a publisher, you have to actually get an agent who's going to represent your book. You can reach out to agents if someone accepts it. They will then take those to the publishers. Once the publisher likes it and accepts it, you'll probably get anywhere between 6 months to 2 to 3 years to finish your manuscript. So you're going to have a lot of time. So the bulk of book writing actually happens after the publisher accepts it.
Got it.
And in
And
terms of your
yes,
process, around your question about the process, sorry, go ahead, Gautam.
yeah, please. I was just about to ask that same thing. Please.
Yeah, in terms of the process of writing this book, look, any non-fiction book is typically going to be a journey of at least 2 to 5 years of fairly deep and intensive research. In my case, it was a 5 year journey. In my previous job, I used to work on a lot of these issues around public policy and regulatory governance. I would say there are three main things that one has to think about. One is the structure and the writing of it, wherein your writing has to be fairly simple. A lot of people often complicate their writing because they think that's beautiful, but people aren't looking for beautiful writing, they're looking for clear writing. Your writing has to be it's like a window. It has to be it doesn't have to have character of its own. It has to show what's outside or what the main thing. So one, the quality of the writing has to be really simple and easy to understand. The second is the research has to be credible. That can take many forms. In the case of my book, for example, I spoke to many people who have been in government, because if I'm writing in government as someone who's never actually been in it, I have to get their perspectives. So I did about about 2 dozen odd interviews with people who've interacted with government or have been in government, former chief election commissioners, former Supreme Court judges, etc., and made sure their perspectives get reflected in the book. The second thing is you really need to understand what the literature on this topic is. If someone's written the exact same book as you, then perhaps no publisher would want to publish you because it's already out there. So I had to read everything that's all on this topic in this segment. So there's In Service of the Republic by Vijay Kelkar and Ajay Shah. There's a couple of compendiums of public policy by Pratap Bhanu Mehta and his team. So there were a whole bunch of literature. I would have probably read about 20-25 books just specifically on this topic. And finally, you have to have that narrative core. And for me, that narrative core was going to be incidents that people have probably heard about, from, let's say, the custodial killings that happened in Tamil Nadu during the peak of COVID, to the emergency, to demonetization. Use those as the narrative hooks and then draw people into a conversation about what actually happened in the background. Why did things happen that way? And go one level deeper. So, those three things, which is your quality of clarity of writing, research, and the narrative hooks, I think become the three things to think about when writing a non-fiction book.
Wonderful. I think this would help a lot for aspiring writers, including myself. I'm also hoping that I will be able to write something similar some one day. And this helps a lot. I mean, the main key takeaway from me was to have that commercial mindset, to have a marketing mindset where how does this book sell? What are the audience that it will attract? I think that's it's a key takeaway for me from this conversation. So I want to, this is something that this is the impression I got when I was going through your profile, where you have, on one hand, you're a trained economist, you've been a Rhodes Scholar, and your academic life has been largely about economics and to some extent, public policy as well. And then you have your writing career, you have a journalistic career, and you are now a published author, and then suddenly you have your business career on going on to the other side, going parallelly. So these are, for somebody who is a layman, these can be come across as three independent areas of practice. But I'm sure that you see a convergence, you see like a common element coming across. I just want to know what is in your mind the converging areas, and how does these skill set of being an economist, being a public policy analyst, being a published author, all contribute to the current career path that you're in.
That's a great question. Certainly, in my previous job, like things intersected a lot more because I was at a impact investing fund where we made equity investments in startups, and we did not-for-profit grants with the assumption that if you want to change systems, if you want to change, for example, financial inclusion in India, or if you want to change education in India, you need both startups and you need non-profits and better governance and all of that. Because of which, I was working on privacy, and one of the things we came thought about was that you also need to change the way regulations are designed in the country. That got me into regulatory governance. So there was very subject matter convergence between the two. Now that I work at a startup where there's nothing non-profit about any of it.
Yeah.
The key theme that I think underlines what I do here and even the work that I do in terms of writing is this notion of institution building. At the end of the day, startups are also institutions, right? Startups are also a group of individuals governed by certain rules. In fact, we have seen in recent past that many startups have gone down because they've not had good institutional governance, because there have not been sufficient checks and balances. So I always approach my work, even while I'm working at my startup, from this lens of institutional governance, corporate governance. And that's a key recurring theme in how I approach my work. And that's also the theme in which I think about how do we think about governance. Sure, there might be certain things on which I don't agree with a certain political party. But what I have to be very cognizant about is that there has to be a way to kind of come up with policy and then have to abide by whatever comes out of it and be okay with it. So this this underlying theme of how do you design institutions, be it private sector institutions, early stage or late stage, and public sector institutions, is something that really motivates me.
Okay, understood. I mean, so what I see in this is that there are three major areas that I can, deduct from your conversation. One is corporate governance, institutions, the Lego regulations, all this kind of overlaps in these fields, in these areas, and that adds that like propels you to the career that you have right now. Excellent. And in
Absolutely.
terms of skill set, right? In terms of skill sets also, I want to understand, like, you have certain skill sets, and how does that skill set help? Like, for example, writing, right? Writing is something that very obvious in your work, be it creative writing, be it, other kinds of writing. How does something like a writing skill, because I'm sure there are people out there who are currently in not maybe non-profit in public policy kind of space, maybe who are full-time writers also, who wants to perhaps take a step into the world of business. So for somebody like them, how can they use their skill set, and is there any other skill set they can get which was added to perhaps like a data mindset or a data analytics mindset? What in your mind, what can be the path forward?
So look, every job is going to have its hard skills, right? And those are difficult to um, especially as you get later in your career to pick up, right? Because then you kind of get specialized. So if you're in financial services, then understanding of just financial models becomes important. If you're in venture capital, then understanding business models becomes really important. If you're in sales, then your sales skill become really important, or your knowledge of how funnels work becomes really important, right? So there are a set of hard skills which are going to be very, very sector specific based on what sector someone wants to get into. But I think I take your question as thinking about some of the softer skills and some of those skills that become transferable as one moves across spaces. The first one is communication. I wouldn't even restrict it to writing. Everything is really about communication because at the end of the day, we're social animals. We are differentiated from animals because we can communicate. And I know that sounds really basic, but I think that's really important because even while writing the book, I'm communicating an idea. I'm trying to make it easy to understand. I'm trying to make it something that gets people involved in that conversation. At the same time, when I'm working a job, I'm doing a lot of internal communication. I'm communicating with people who report into me, people I report into, my peers. Like, imagine in any typical corporate setup, the number of emails and messages you see every day, right? We're flooding information. And therefore, to be able to communicate that information in a succinct and evocative manner that leads to some kind of outcomes becomes really important. So, communication is key whether you're doing non-profit writing, whatever, or you're doing a private sector job. The second thing that you have to really think about is what I think about is first principles thinking. That because my first job was as management consulting. And in management consulting, you are typically just picked up and put in a sector that you have no context on, and then in 2 weeks. Or maybe 3 to 4 months, you have to deliver those outcomes. And then you start becoming a good first or principles problem solver, which is to say, okay, what's the problem I face? How do I think about it from various perspectives? And that is true for the book itself, where a lot of the thinking was about coming up with frameworks, questioning my own frameworks to be able to get better at it. And in the private sector context, that becomes things like if I'm facing a problem, what are the various options I have available? Which of those options do I pursue? So that iterative approach to problem solving becomes really important as a soft skill, whether it be writing or non-profit and for-profit. So I think communication and iterative first principles problem solving is something that becomes important in both spaces.
Correct. And what could be some of the challenges you're facing in the current role? I mean, I know your designation is lead of corporate development. So, if you can just give me a glimpse of what are some of the day-to-day challenges that you face in this role.
So this is the first operating role I've had because before this I've been in management consulting at McKinsey and I've been in impact investing at Omidyar Network. This is the first time I'm dealing with an operating setup and it's been about 2 years and quite a steep learning experience. Now for me personally, and I presume that's your question, not about the company but about my journey, I've come to the realization that the biggest thing really is your team in operating setups. That includes how do you run good hiring processes to be able to hire people who are both going to be from a skills perspective, but more importantly from a culture perspective, be able to enter and do well in that role. But also importantly, the people that you already have, how do you groom them better? How do you set them up for success? How do you give them the right support? How do you give them the right incentives? Those become really important. And for me, it's been a journey of learning that and learning to be better at it. So I would both call it a problem as well as an opportunity, which is this is something that really, as someone who's privileged to be in the kind of leadership group of the organization, is something that really keeps me awake a lot of the time. So that's one. The second is startups in general are hard, right? Because you're dealing with a lot of ambiguity and a lot of uncertainty. Especially we work in financial services. Financial services is heavily regulated and regulations change and they change sometimes overnight. So being able to build a business that is robust to the uncertainties around it becomes really important. So the way it manifests in my job is that I have to constantly think about, do I have sufficient buffer as a business to be able to absorb these shocks and these uncertainties that are thrown at me, and going back to the first point, am I acting as a shock absorber in the system that is then reducing how much of this translates on to people in my team? So that dealing with uncertainty and managing teams, especially growing teams in an unstructured environment, become the two most important challenges of a startup environment.
Thank you. I think this reminds me of my journey, a bit of my journey, so because I was working as the HR business partner to a startup, and then before that, as part of my consulting role, I was advising startups as well. And this is again what you said is absolutely bang on. This is something that has come up over and over again in my journey, where it's there is uncertainty, and how do you reduce the uncertainty in your own way? How do you make sure that the people whom you are supporting is equipped to deal with the uncertainty without impacting their mental health, impacting their physical health, all aspects of well-being. That is a challenge that I, as an HR manager, had been facing in my previous roles, and to some extent, my current role as well. And how we can come up with initiatives and programs, and how we can equip people managers, to deal with those situations better. How can you train managers to give better feedback, to identify key competencies, to measure where their reportees are, or their peers are at in these competencies, identify synergies, identify how the workflow can be optimized. So, it reminds me a lot about my previous roles, and yeah, thank you for that. And that gives me an understanding about the role that you're in. And I was going through before this podcast, I was doing a bit of research about Club, and I realized that the business model that Club is operating is a revenue sharing model, and a revenue sharing financing model. And that is relatively unique, is what I'm feeling. Most of the revenue, the capital funding or the revenue, the capital funding or financing has been through equity, is what I'm aware of. I just want to understand from you, why do you think the revenue sharing model in Indian context, or the domain that you're operating in, offers an advantage, or what kind of people are we offering the advantage to? Just want to know your thoughts on that.
Understood. So, Gautam, a little bit of context here might be useful, right? So, the kind of brands that companies that we work with are typically what one might call digital SMEs. So, these are consumer brands. Think all the way from someone selling T-shirts and clothes on Instagram, all the way to even listed companies that are, let's say, selling furniture or jewelry or something, right? So, these are typically consumer goods kind of brands who are selling digitally. Historically, these early stage companies haven't had access to capital because, A, when you think about these kind of consumer brands, they don't necessarily have the hockey stick growth that tech companies do, and therefore not necessarily suitable for VC money. And VC money in the long run actually turns out to be fairly expensive. So very often they don't want to do it, or at least not for all their capital requirements. But at the same time, debt funding was also not something that was available to them because these are early stage companies, don't have enough of a track record. They don't have anything to give as hard collateral. Typically, people have requested, fixed deposits or house on mortgage and whatnot. Right? It's going to be very, very onerous for promoters here. They don't have as much data. They also just don't have those many assets. So they've because of all of these, they've also not been serviced by banks, and banks and even non-bank are reticent to work with them. Even if they work with them, they take several months before some sanction comes. And think of a small team which has to then spend several months doing several churns on documents to be able to access that. That was the environment in which we were entering as a club. We realized that for a lot of these brands, the key resource and the key asset they have is their actual revenue. Just that some of this revenue is going to be in future. It's not going to be in the present and it's not in the past. These are businesses that are going to generate stable revenue flows for the next 12 months, 24 months, etc. And obviously, that analysis we do at our end. But is there a way to convert their future revenues into cash upfront? So let's say I know I'm going to do 100 rupees worth of business for the next 48 months, and people can predict that fairly accurately. So can I convert part of that entire pool of money that I'm going to generate, which is going to be 4,800 rupees? Can I, let's say, convert 500 of that as cash upfront so I can invest in capex and make that 100 rupees a month become 120 rupees a month? That is what we're trying to do. Why are we able to do that? The primary reason, and that's the reason we work with these kind of brands, is because now with them coming online, we're able to get a lot more granular data on them so that we can analyze them much better. We can understand their cash flows far more granularly. We can understand where is the cash coming from, where is the cash going, how stable is the cash, how large are these cash flows. So all of that data that is now being generated by this wave of digitization that you're seeing in India and elsewhere is basically the moment in time that a company like Club can exist. So I definitely think that there is going to be a wider capital ecosystem where debt of this nature, revenue-based financing, venture debt, equity investments, all of that is going to basically be one clear spectrum. And I think revenue financing will be a very, very key part of that spectrum.
Right. And what I understand is, from a human resource perspective, people who are equipped with data analytics skills, big data skills, they become the core of your operations primarily because, in my mind, you need to understand the risk that you're getting into. You need to understand the potential of the company because you're betting on them. So understanding that their business growth trajectory becomes at its core is an analytics. It's a power of analytics. It's a power of data. So I think that becomes core, isn't it? I think that could be one real USP that you'll be carrying forward.
Absolutely. And as compared to a traditional lending business where most people are either sales or operations, for Club, more than 50% of our company is tech, product, and risk. Our systems are designed to be extremely data backed, which means a company that provides us their data will get capital within about 48 to 72 hours. Compare that to spending several weeks or months working with banks. This is just in time capital, and that happens because we have an entire tech ecosystem that has been built over the years through heavy investments in tech and product. At the same time, we have an entire risk team that then looks at this data, looks at historical trends, look at what's the biggest predictor of default, what's the biggest predictor of things getting difficult, or what's the biggest predictor of things actually being turning out well for a company. And all of that data, tons and tons of it just flows through through the organization in real time, which is why we intrinsically think of ourselves not as a lending business but as a tech data product business.
Right. Right. Yes, I mean, that's a great insight. I think that offers a lot of takeaways for somebody who, for a viewer who hasn't been exposed to a revenue sharing platform, financing organizations that are focused on revenue recovery. So thank you for that. I just want to take you to some time before you got into Club and before you got into Omidyar and McKinsey, where you started off with Stephens, and you got into Oxford as a Rhodes Scholar. I just want to know what has that journey been? How has those foundation years been? what are some of the content that inspire to take up, whether it be consulting, whether it be public policy practice, whether it be investment, venturing into investment space in Omidyar, and now into venture capital, now into financing in Club. What has been those foundation years like? And just want to know your thoughts on that.
Sure. In terms of the brief background, I spent most of my schooling years in Delhi. Then after that, went to college, did an economics degree out of St. Stephen's College. Worked a couple of years at McKinsey across sectors, including financial services, steel, etc. And then spent a couple of years in England at Oxford doing my master's in economics. Came back to India for the last 5 years, built out the privacy tech and cybersecurity practice at Omidyar, and last 2 years at Club. So that's the brief background. Now, to your question about things that inspired or paved the way for this journey, I think the most fundamental thing, honestly, was just a lot of reading on current affairs. And this is back in the day was newspapers. So picked it up in middle school and used to regularly read newspapers, a lot of magazines, everything from the India Today, Outlook, long form, short form, whatever it form that took. So that really helped this entire journey because St. Stephen's, for example, has an interview before you get in. So even to make conversation in that interview, make conversation in the McKinsey interview, or just generally come across someone who's kind of aware of the world. Current affairs has always, I thought, been a key differentiator and a key source of strength for me. So that's been the starting point. In St. Stephen's, in particular, I think a lot of development economics was things that got me really, really interested. A lot of texts that have been, written by Amartya Sen, by Jean Dress, by Ritika Khera, and a whole bunch of other people who've really written about India and its developmental challenges. Which therefore kept me really, really engaged in that entire space of development economics. Even while I was at McKinsey, I spent two of my longest projects. One was a pharma plant based out of Gujarat, in rural Gujarat. So that was 7 months there on the ground, really understanding how does a manufacturing setup in rural India actually look like. And it's easy to talk about it theoretically sitting in the classroom, but it's very different to experience it in a rural setting in India. And that's the kind of experience McKinsey gave me. I also wrote a report there. This was 2014, where we wrote about what should India do to really become a middle income country in the next decade or so. So, development economics has continued to stay that core line. Even when I went to Oxford, I specialized in development economics. My thesis was on the rollout of a particular insurance scheme that was rolled out in India before Ayushman Bharat was. And that also got me into Omidyar Network. At Omidyar Network, as you know, I got a lot more deeply involved in tech and data and privacy and digital rights. Then I started reading a lot about how do you think about building nations, because that really is the project that all of us are involved in at the end of the day. So I read books like The Narrow Corridor by Robinson and Ismoglu, and a bunch of that genre. Read a lot of public policy books, a lot of books, as I said, Ajay Shah, Vijay Kelkar's In Service of the Republic, and then The Malevolent Republic. So a whole bunch of these kind of books. That then led me into Club, where I thought, okay, after going through this entire public policy journey, it's really important to think about how to actually build businesses and startups in this country. So that's what got me to Club, and that's where I am.
Yeah. So one of the challenges that I face myself is, I'm sure people who are viewing this also know, is that when you consume a lot of content in this world where content is, uh, quite a lot out there, I wanted to ask two questions. One is, how do you pick up? Is there a mental framework in which you say, hey, this is a good one to pick up. This is where I invest my time in, either be it a book, be it a podcast, be it anything. That's one question. The second question is, once you absorb those knowledge, is there a way you store somewhere? Is it digitally stored, like a Notion or like personal notes that you have, so that whenever you are venturing into something, something of a creative nature, either be it creating a journalistic article or a book that you just did, or something on the work side, is there a way that you erase this information, collect the recall the information? Just want to know how you do it.
Sorry. So here's how I think about it. I read and absorb content first and foremost because it's enjoyable. If it stops being enjoyable, I'll probably not consume it. So I don't try to put up too much friction that will prevent me from reading or listening to things. My approach to this is fairly clear. One is that I prefer kind of quality over quantity, which means if I start reading a book and I just don't think it's resonating with me, I would be okay to leave a book. And I think a lot of us struggle with it because once we get a book, we feel like we have to power till the end. I don't do that. If a book is not working for me, it's not working. Secondly, I read about 3 or 4 books at the same time, which means I can kind of mentally switch between different genres, and that keeps me excited about the book. In terms of knowledge organization, I don't try to take copious notes because what's important for me, at least my mental model is, I think of the brain as a processing unit rather than as a memory unit, which means as long as I know where to look for that information, I'll probably be fine. So, for example, one might argue that when I'm reading a book, should I be taking notes and highlighting and doing all of that? But I know that most books have a glossary. I can just go to the glossary and just look up where a particular topic occurred in the book, and I don't necessarily need to write it down to be able to do that. Yes, it's a little inefficient than perhaps if I had written it down, and that would be easier to refer to, but I just get through with a lot more material. So that's my primary thing. The second thing I do is there's often a great resistance in India to paying for content. And I at least narrow down a couple of journals that I really like and just pay for their content. So currently, for business news, for example, I'm subscribed to the Ken in the Morning Context. That creates good incentive for me not only to support good journalism but also keep myself disciplined and on that track of consuming this content. Um, and third is I try to set up context in a way that I actually enjoy consuming this content. So for me, reading of that article, the daily article of the morning context of the Ken happens really early in the morning. I enjoy it. That's part of my routine. Part of my routine is to also these days listen to podcasts. So I just go early in the morning before work, wake up, walk for 30 minutes, absorb the sun, get some fresh air, and listen to a podcast. So I also, there's obviously a book, Atomic Habits, which tends to always be the number one or number two bestseller in India, and I'm sure most people have read it. But there's so much rich knowledge there that you can actually apply to your day-to-day lives to really form these habits of content absorption.
Right. Your habits are quite similar to mine as well. The first thing I do is to listen to a few podcasts in the morning that gives me updates about the news. For instance, FinShots is my favorite. And then you have a few podcasts from the Ken as well. I think I'm trying to recall First Principles and Daily something. I'm missing the name, but and of course Amit Verma is one of my favorite podcasts as well. And a lot of I think the one of the recent discoveries that blew my mind is podcast in itself, where if you just the other day I was just reading an article in which if you would just look at the text the transcribed text of these podcasts, it just usually goes as long as a half of a book even. So you're essentially reading a book in a 1.5 to 2 hours time. I think that's a I mean, and that too, like the ability of the brain to connect to ideas even passively also you're using that to your advantage to gain knowledge. Yeah, I think that point is really useful for all the people who are outside. You get to explore podcasts.
Absolutely, and I think it works for different people in different ways, right? I think for me, getting into podcast was a bit of a journey, and then I had to set it up in this way of kind of my morning walk routine that actually really got me into it. So to that extent, I think everyone's going to have their journeys. Everyone will absorb contents in different formats in different ways. So I think it's for people to kind of discover on their own.
Yeah. So I was just doing. We are now moving towards the end of our conversation, and one thing I really want to do is to pick your brain on the way you approach journalistic writing. So I was looking at one of your most interesting ones, two articles that I've just tried to bake down how what kind of approach you were doing. The one was around the one nation, one ration card, the article that you've written. In that, I realized that what you've essentially done, that you have sort of did a comparison between the idea of one nation, one ration card with the GST, the principles of GST or the frameworks of GST. And that has to be really fascinating because essentially you are comparing the foundational principles or the frameworks of two organizations and two institutions, sorry, and then you are trying to find out how one can learn from the other. That was fascinating. The second, the article that I was trying to look into, what kind of approach that you did is the privacy policy and consent on digital contracts. And then you were going through best practices. So the core of the article is about what are the best practices out there and what we can learn from those best practices, especially that point around the ratings, privacy ratings, and behavioral nudges. I think that was fascinating to read those. Do you have these approaches in your mind when you're writing this, or does it come naturally to you?
It obviously takes a little bit of thinking, right? Both of those articles were based on a lot of reading and thinking that had been done on those topics with along with my co-authors for each of those articles. What I find in journalistic writing, a couple of things that very often people write op-eds, kind of which I read them and I always wonder what is new or what is interesting here, right? So I think the at least my desire always is to write things that are both nuanced but more importantly new. But the challenge then becomes if you're writing something that's very nuanced and specialized, if you're talking about privacy policies, I mean, how many of us really care about privacy policies? How do you write it in a way that people will really understand it, that doesn't become too technocratic? To that extent, I think mental models, stories, narratives, frameworks work much better. So I can write about one nation, one ration card using a lot of data from the PDA system and all of that, but that'll be only interesting to someone who's really, really ingrained into this whole conversation around the PDS. How do you make that conversation more palatable to people generally interested in public policy? Maybe someone reads it and is not interested in either in GST or in the PDS system, but says, hey, look, maybe there's something here interesting that I can talk about in water conservation, in climate change, or whatever else, right? So, this whole notion of how do you think about thematic consistencies across different areas and talk about those is really interesting to me. Even if you think about my book Cage Tiger, the genesis of that is that the frameworks I use in Cage Tiger are actually frameworks that someone had come up with long time ago. In fact, a Ministry of Finance committee had come up with in the context of regulatory institutions. So think about SEBI and RBI, etc. And I got thinking that they've come up with principles and how do you design a good RBI or a SEBI, but can we extend that and talk about how do you design a good police system? How do you design a good parliament? How do you design a good judiciary? So this notion of taking principles that are proven out in a certain context and thinking about can they be applied in a different context is certainly an area that is interesting to me, and I also think that's an area that's easier for people to understand because then it is proven out, it is happening somewhere, it's not as theoretical anymore.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a good framework for anybody who's starting off to be and maybe like maybe venturing into a new space as well. Can we borrow some of the foundation concepts of one space into the other? And I personally I had benefited that a bit in my career as well. Uh, I don't know if I've spoken to you about that, but I've been a civil service aspirant as well for 3 4 years, and the knowledge and the rigor and the kind of habits I built during that period has helped me a lot as a professional when I came to the domain of business. Now, even now in HR, I'm able to be multidisciplinary in approach. I'm able to look at the typical HR problems and come to me in a way where not just from the lens of the profitability or business growth, also from perspective of employee well-being, also from perspective of a sociological angle, also maybe from an economic angle. What are the incentives out there for certain players to act in a certain way. So, like you said, I think in writing as well that really applies, and I'm trying to bring that in my own small ways. Thank you so much for that. I just want to end with a question: what is in store for 2024? What are the things that you want to consume? What are your future, hopes for yourself and for the country? And what are the things that what are the books, maybe films, books, podcasts, you're hoping to read and consume?
The biggest goal for 2024 really for me is to think about mental health and happiness and really the science behind all of it. So these days I'm listening to this podcast called The Happiness Lab. These are daily episodes of about, oh no, sorry, back in the day it was weekly, but they've done hundreds of episodes. So I listen to it daily, which is 20 to 30 minutes. And they really talk about the scientific thoughts behind happiness. So, for example, many of us would think, hey, if I just had a little bit more money, I would be happier. But one of the early insights I got from listening to this podcast was that beyond an income of 70,000 USD, there's no statistically proven interaction correlation between the happiness and income level. So, I want to kind of get more of these insights which will help me build myself up for what all of us, I'm sure, will agree. We live in a generation of great uncertainty. There's political uncertainty, there's environmental uncertainty, there's economic uncertainty, right? So, through all of that uncertainty, the only way we survive as a species and as individual human beings is by taking care of ourselves emotionally and socially. So that's the big thing in store for me. So I do plan to consume that content and then also write about that a lot more. Professionally, I am in the process of setting up two debt funds as part of my job at Club. These will be the only debt funds focused on digital SMEs in India and in UAE. And that should be an exciting journey of setting up a new credit fund, which will be fairly unique in both the geographies it operates in. And look, as far as nations concerned, obviously we go into an election year. We are also in that phase where I think a lot of important elections are taking place this year, all the way from the US to Russia to our neighbors in Pakistan, and I just think it's a period of great uncertainty. And even as all of us in our little and great ways try to contribute and make sense of the uncertainties around it, I think for me the 2024 is at least a year of inner reflection and inner care, so that we can deal with the outer reflections and the outer world much better.
Yes, thank you. Thank you so much for this. And I also my intention is also to focus on reflect a lot and create a lot and put my ideas out there and be at least if I can make a difference, 1% difference in somebody's life. And that's the purpose of this podcast is also to be able to grow 1% by listening to people who have made meaningful use of their time in their life. So such as yours. So thank you so much for joining, and all the best for all your future endeavors. I hope you write you write many more books in your career, and we stay connected. And I hope we meet again in another setting, in another podcast where you have a different book to talk about, different experience to talk about. And yeah, thank you so much for that. Um,
Thank you so much for having me,
so
Gautam. It was a pleasure speaking to you.
thank you. And listeners, please subscribe. We are available on YouTube. We are also available on Spotify in audio format. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you.